Under his fourth ground of appeal, concerning the cruel treatment at the Zenica Music School from May to September 93, Hadžihasanović argues that the trial chamber erred by finding that he failed to take the reasonable measures necessary to punish the perpetrators and prevent such acts. First, Hadžihasanović argues that the trial chamber failed to properly consider the evidence provided by witness Jamal Merdan, his deputy commander, and witness HF, a senior officer of the 3rd Corps Command, that measures were taken by the 3rd Corps to investigate allegations of mistreatment at the Zenica Music School. The appeal chamber notes that the trial chamber did not ignore the testimony of these two witnesses, but after reviewing the totality of the evidence before it, decided to accord greater weight to other evidence. The trial chamber found, based on the many accounts by former prisoners at the music school, that the Zenica Music School's basement consistently housed between 10 and 30 detainees from 18 April until 20 August 93. The trial chamber further found that Hadžihasanović received alarming information from other sources, which established the need for further inquiry based on allegations of mistreatment. Thus, the trial chamber's finding that an investigation of the allegations of cruel treatment would have enabled Hadžihasanović to identify the persons responsible for the violence does not turn solely on the truthfulness of witnesses Jamal Merdan and HF. Second, Hadžihasanović argues that the trial chamber failed to properly consider evidence that the arrest, detention, and alleged mistreatment of detainees at the music school was concealed by some members of the 7th Brigade. The appeal chamber finds that the trial chamber noted that there was an intention on the part of the soldiers present at the school to conceal the mistreatment inflicted on the detainees, but concluded that this had no bearing on Hadžihasanović's criminal responsibility. Indeed, the trial chamber found that Hadžihasanović had received information that his subordinates were committing mistreatment at the Zenica Music School from sources outside the 7th Brigade, such that any attempted concealment by members of the 7th Brigade was rendered secondary. Third, Hadžihasanović submits that the measures he took with respect to the Zenica Music School were necessary and reasonable. The trial chamber considered Hadžihasanović's arguments that he had taken preventive measures to ensure that civilians and prisoners of war were treated in accordance with international humanitarian law, and that he took steps to investigate allegations of mistreatment. The trial chamber nevertheless concluded that Hadžihasanović did not make genuine efforts to initiate an appropriate investigation into the allegations of cruel treatment, whereas such an investigation would have enabled him to discover the identity of the persons responsible for the violence. For the reasons set out in the judgment, the appeal chamber finds that Hadžihasanović failed to demonstrate that no reasonable trier of fact could have concluded that, given the evidence, he failed to take necessary and reasonable measures to punish the perpetrators of the cruel treatment at the Zenica Music School and prevent further mistreatment. I now turn to Hadžihasanović's arguments under his fifth ground of appeal concerning the murder and cruel treatment in Oražak in October 93. Hadžihasanović submits that the trial chamber erred by finding that he failed to take necessary and reasonable measures to prevent the murder of Dragan Popović and the cruel treatment committed by El Mujahedin detachment in the Oražak camp against 5 civilians abducted on 19 October 1993. He argues that the trial chamber erred in finding that he had de jure authority over the members of the El Mujahedin detachment and in finding that he exercised effective control over the El Mujahedin detachment. Since de jure authority is only one factor that helps to establish effective control, and because the question is resolvable on the basis of effective control alone, the appeal chamber declines to address whether Hadžihasanović had de jure authority over the El Mujahedin detachment. The trial chamber found that Hadžihasanović exercised effective control over the detachment on the basis that the evidence before it showed that 3 types of indicia of effective control were satisfied, namely, the power to give orders to the detachment and have them executed, the conduct of combat operations involving the detachment, and the absence of any other authority over the detachment. First, the appeal chamber recognizes that the power to give orders and have them executed can serve as an indicium of effective control. In the present case, the trial chamber took certain orders of resubordination into account, though to varying degrees as indicia of effective control. However, for the reasons set out in the judgment, the appeals chamber finds that none of the resubordination orders, either individually or collectively, is sufficient to establish the existence of effective control. Second, the appeal chamber finds that while the findings relied upon by the trial chamber confirm that the El Mujahedin detachment took part in several combat operations in September and October 1993, and that this occurred within the framework established by the operational group Bosanska Krajina and the Third Corps, they do not necessarily provide sufficient support for the conclusion that Hadžihasanović had effective control over the El Mujahedin detachment in the sense of having the material ability to prevent or punish its members should they commit crimes. Notably, several findings of the trial chamber demonstrate that the El Mujahedin detachment maintained a significant degree of independence from the units it fought alongside on various issues, which belies the trial chamber's conclusion that the El Mujahedin detachment was under the effective control of the Third Corps. The trial chamber found, for example, that the detachment members were anxious to maintain their independence and reserved the right to decide whether they would take part in combat operations. Thus, while these trial chambers' findings indicate that the Third Corps cooperated with the El Mujahedin detachment, they are insufficient to establish the existence of a relationship of effective control between the Third Corps and the El Mujahedin detachment. Third, with regard to the absence of any other authority over the El Mujahedin detachment, the appeal chamber finds that some of the trial chamber's findings suggest that the detachment was more under the influence of Muslim clerics than under that of the Third Corps. However, the appeal chamber disputes the relevance of the criterion identified by the trial chamber as an indicator of the existence of effective control. Hadžihasanović's effective control cannot be established by process of elimination. The absence of any other authority over the detachment in no way implies that Hadžihasanović exercised effective control in this case. Last, I turn to Hadžihasanović's argument that he could not have effective control over the detachment if the only way for the Third Corps to obtain the release of the civilians abducted on 19 October 1993 was to use force. The appeals chamber finds that the military operation that the trial chamber expected the Third Corps to undertake to rescue these hostages would be comparable to to that necessary to obtain the release of hostages from an enemy force rather than a force under its effective control. Regardless of whether the use of force was materially feasible or advisable to save the lives of the hostages, the facts of the case reveal a situation in which the relationship between the El Mujahedin detachment and the Third Corps was not one of subordination. Instead, it was close to overt hostility, since the only way to control the detachment was to attack them, as if they were a distinct enemy force. This scenario is at odds with the premise of the trial chamber that the El Mujahedin detachment was subordinated to the Third Corps.